We're looking for matzah feasts, and first in verse 3, we've got when the Shabbat is. And I was reading about the Shabbat this week, again, reminding myself how the Shabbat came to be. Very interesting what I found from the church fathers, so-called, and that is that the Shabbat was made by the bishops of the Roman Church for this reason. They want to further distance themselves from the Jews and from the Muslims later on by the 7th century. They want to show themselves that they worship a different God on a different day than these lowly Jews. And then once that was proclaimed and accepted by the emperor, well, that was actually Constantine that accepted that, then it was open season on the Jewish people. And they got smaller and smaller through pogroms, through persecutions, smaller and smaller. And our sect, the Nazarenes or the Ebionites, moved out, moved into areas of Persia, of Syria that weren't overlorded by the Romans. And there they had their assemblies, many, many of them, until that 7th century. And Muhammad took up the sword and went into these assemblies of Nazarenes, of Ebionites, and forced them into Islam. However, Islam took up a lot of the theology of James the Just, the Nazarene Acts, of what's called today in scholarly circles Jewish Christianity. I just wish they would continue to call it what Yeshua called it, and that is the Nazarenes. I like that a lot. It means those of the branch. Certainly, especially these days, we are of the branch. So here we have listing of the appointed times of Yahweh. There he is. And here we have the Passover, which has passed on the Zadokite calendar. It's another thing we've got to talk a little about, how it is that the new year came before the equinox. Yes, I studied and did that a lot this week because to me that just shouldn't be. And really the new year should have been on the 26th of March instead of the 19th of March. And I know some of you feel that way too because our calendar says the 19th. Is it too early? Well, there are two schools of that, and we'll get back to that a little later. Why our calendar says the 19th and not the 26th? Yes, I'll explain that too. So on the first day of matzah, is in this, the days we eat unleavened bread. On the first day, you have a set apart gathering. You do no servile work. And you shall bring an offering made by fire to Yahweh for 7 days. On the seventh day, then, again, is a set apart gathering. You do no servile work. Well, if we were an assembly, it would be a very good thing not to sacrifice all that was needed on each of those 7 days, but rather to bring some kind of sacrificial offering. Ministries like this simply don't prosper when the people don't give. And for those of you that give a little bit, I commend you. You'll be blessed for that. You're being blessed by that. And you should be doing that. The way we've always financed the Yahad in the past, at least the last 5-10 years, is through dues, because that's the way the Torah tells us to. Dues in the scriptures called the temple tax, half shekel. And there's not a decision whether it's every 6 months or once a year. And that would be a good way to support any church as well. Then, of course, on top of that, you've got other tithes, second tithes, offerings, alms, etc. So Moshe says, Speak to the children of Israel, that's you, and you shall say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, and shall reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And that's wave sheaf offering, because the priest will wave the sheaf before Yahweh for your acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest waves it. And that was about the time that I believe Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that Yeshua was already risen, and he told her, do not touch me. I'm not yet risen to the Father. Now, some of us believe that what he's saying is, since he healed people and told them to check in with the priests in the temple in order to seal that healing so that all righteousness must be done, and remembering that the people of those days believed that Yahweh, the Spirit, was inhabiting the Kadoshim, the Holy of Holy place, that little room in the temple that was set apart for Yahweh only and for a high priest once a year. Well, they believed that he was living in there. And this is because this is what the people thought. This is what Yeshua taught to a great extent by sending healed people there to the temple to be pronounced clean by the priest. So when he says, I've not yet ascended, a cadre of us understand this to mean and believe that he had not gone up to the temple to be examined by the priest and be called clean of death. Before we get then a story about him ascending into the sky with witnesses. But first of all, in order to fulfill the righteousness all the way, he did fulfill a lot of the righteousness, but he had to go up and be looked over by the priest. See, do we go on with anything else from this week? Goes to the wave sheaf. All right. Now, I wouldn't even imagine to try to tell you what Passover and Matzah Feast is all about. I've been doing it for many years at this time of the year. However, I would think by now, following this way, it being an elemental doctrine of Yahweh, that you would already know about all this and be following it year by year, if for no other reason than your tradition picked up from primitive times. Yes, you know what it's about. It's primarily about doing something and not doing something. He wants you to eat the bread of affliction for 7 days. And he doesn't want you to eat yeasted bread, because in this case, symbolically, yeast stands for sin. The idea of getting the yeast out of your body is that you are symbolically getting the sin out of your body, and then obediently you are receiving that atonement for those sins. They no longer exist in your life. So I made a big mistake this morning. Yes, I did. Even me. We got up at about 4 in the morning and we decided to have breakfast. And we had some scrambled eggs, like an omelet. It was very good. I put some of that green sauce on it. Very good. However, I felt at that time that I needed to have some millet toast. Now, I don't know if there's yeast in millet toast or not, but the tradition didn't come to my mind at that time. And Trelly popped some millet bread in the toaster, and I had two delicious pieces of millet. Now, I don't know whether there was um, leaven, yeast in that bread or not, but I'm supposing that there was. And it didn't catch up with me until later on in the day when I woke up here later on that I had eaten yeasted bread on matzah feast. Hmm. Am I going to be in trouble? Is a thunderbolt going to come down in my area? I've been looking for it, but it hasn't. And let me tell you why. Because of something we read in the Didaché, the teaching of Yeshua HaMashiach to the 12 apostles, which we want to look at today. But nevertheless, let me give you what we believe that the first apostles gave to disciples about situations like this, where you're a zakar, you just don't remember who you are and where you are and what you're doing. Shimon Bar Clopas, who wrote the Didache, we suppose, also known as Simon the Zealot, he says, do the best you can. Now, you knew that. We've all talked about that. Do the best you can. Well, at that time, that's about the best I could. So I do believe the Father maybe overlooks it, maybe just forgives me for that because I knew better. What difference does it make whether we eat yeast or not in our day? Doesn't seem to make any difference. And I suppose that most Nazarene believers of today just skip that thing and go ahead and eat what they want to. Now, I suppose they sneak out and have lobster every 3 days or so, or eel, or pork roast. Sure, they do. Sure, they do. Lee, Commander Lee, who's not here tonight, along with the rest of them, he was invited to dinner one night several years ago. He was a missionary in a foreign country, and he came into the house of a Nazarene to have dinner there in Haiti. And what was for dinner? Pork liver, a great delicacy there where they seldom eat any meat because there just isn't any. Pork liver. Question is, if you are invited, what do? You go ahead and eat it in order to honor the cook or your hostess? Do you go ahead or do you embarrass yourself by not eating, by refusing it? Causes you to think about the do nots in Leviticus 11. What happens to me if I would go ahead and eat this other than it just wouldn't appeal to me anyway? But for the sake of hospitality, let me go ahead and eat maybe part of it. Mhm. Well, it says, you make yourself an abomination. How could we stand that? Who would we be abominable to besides ourselves? Definitely, if I ate a pig's liver, I would feel very bad. I would have to go and get it out of my system because, as Kifah said, Nazarene Acts, that kind of meat causes the demons from a filthy, unclean animal to come into you. And I fully believe that because I've seen a few examples of that happening at dinner tables, especially in restaurants. So we've got to avoid that. And what makes us feel so guilty afterwards is, well, we've done wrong. And second of all, because we've been infected not only with some kind of demonic entities, but often trichinitis from the trichina worm that animals that eat slop and mud and manure receive, and that finally will kill them. But fortunately, it's a lot faster working in humans. Now, take a look at a trichina worm sometime and see if you want that in your system. I was in a zoology class. I'm always telling you about what I've been doing because that's all I got. And we had a pickled trichina worm out of a pig to look at. The shell was very hard. And that thing, just a small one, this long, wasn't mature, and it had on its mouth, like a monster you find in the woods or a zombie, if you like that. It was a creature of the deep, creature of darkness. Oh gosh, there are so many tangents we could go off on from here. However, we're not going to. Sorry. So we are told not to eat bread, but it didn't seem to hurt me other than hurt my feelings. There is from that Didaché, the teaching of Yeshua HaMashiach to the 12. I gave you that commandment once again because I don't want you to forget it. Do the best you can. And what that means is just exactly what it says. Do the best you can. You can't slough off. You can't just put it aside. Do the best you can. I talked to a fellow some time ago who is a dedicated Nazarene Israelite, and he confessed that he snuck around and ate bacon once in a while. Well, who can rely on a person that makes a vow to the Father, the great power, and then thinks he can sneak under his napkin and pull out something that's forbidden? I think that difference between bread and pig is that pig can really, really physically kill you. However, bread, it's just a matter of remembering that sin can do the same thing. And disobedience is sin. No, of course it is. I had a question from a person. I was talking to them on the phone just last week. Somebody's come to me, a friend, and needs a place to stay for a few days. I'm trying to decide whether I should let that person in or not from a biblical perspective. What would you say to that question? It's very vague. The Didache tells us, the teaching, Didache, tells us what to do in that situation, along with a lot of other things that happen pretty regularly. It's a book of advice. It's a manual of discipline for Nazarene Israel, especially for overseers, mivakers, and for newbies, proselytes. You're just expecting, as I would, that the people in between the mivaker and the proselyte would already know all the elementary doctrines and be willing to go on to the next stage of knowledge and spirituality. So that wasn't hard for me to answer because I know this text and I know what Yahshua's brother, maybe cousin, judged on this because there it is in his teaching. And what it says basically, I'm bringing this out of my mind now. Why? Because I've done this many times. I'll tell you about that in a minute. That is, yes, let them in if they're a believer. If they're a believer, and you don't take them for a sinner for 2 days. On the third day, they've got to determine whether they're going to stay or leave. But there is a condition about staying there any longer. And that is, are you willing to go out and get employment today? Third day, if they have no employment. The answer is yes or no. If no, they've got to leave. If yes, then you can keep them, if you will, until they work enough to put together a place of their own to stay. It's not a matter of, oh, whenever you get around to it. No, you've got to build a little bit of money together to find even a crude, mean place to stay in the interim. And I would tell them this is our law as Nazarene Israelites. Here, I'll show it to you. Take out your copy of the Didaché, explain who wrote it, and then show them where that advice is. It's good advice. I have let lots of people come in and live with me if I had the room to do that. And I've used that rule a long time. I'm going to go clear back to about the late 80s. I used that rule to determine whether to let them in or not. And I would question them about their belief first off, because I don't want somebody that's entirely unyoked coming in. And I like to make sure, however, I am required to provide the hospitality to a brother or sister for that time, up to 3 days. You're required. Hospitality is a big thing in the Nazarene faith. Remember, there are stories of the disciples going out, no sandals even, and knocking on the door and seeing where they could stay for a little while in a new town. Well, my friends, I first thought, how could they do that? They don't know anybody in that new town. But certainly they would go to someone they knew through their own personal cognizance or through somebody's advice, and somebody who might be equally yoked to stay that time in order to preach and minister in that household and in that new city and divulge the good news to these people. So the Essenes say if somebody like minded with you wants to come, yes, you have to take them in. You have to. It's your duty as a hospitable believer. You must take them in. But it's very important what the Essenes did in this case, and the Nazarenes, as we read in Acts as well, they held everything in common, is to make a decision whether that would be advisable or not. And my decision always came from asking about, are you a believer? And I asked them what it means to be a believer. And I think the first time I might have done this was certainly in the early 80s. And there was a man and a woman that had just gotten married and they had no place to live. They just got married and they came to me. I did the wedding, ill advised. I learned since then not to do everybody's wedding that comes along, turned a lot of them down. Uh, I let them stay, finding out they were believers and they were married because I married him in a ceremony that was religious and they made vows. So the third day comes along after I had explained to the man, who's hardly a man, pretty much just a boy still, about getting the job, getting some income. And he said yes, very seriously, but he wouldn't. And then the fourth day, what job did you get? Oh, I didn't have a job. I thought I'd mow some of the lawn instead. I said, you have to get a job if you want a place to live. And the next day, same thing. And then after that, he began to be flippant with me. I'm not going to leave. I need to stay here till everything works out for me. We know that seldom happens. Things just don't work out unless you plan your work your plan, and pray it through. So I had to get physical with this man and his wife to get them out of my apartment. Again, because I knew what the rule was about this, and this can't go on. You can't continue to allow a faker to be around you or your family. And so I put him out. And of course, they disappeared, and maybe they went back to the house of their parents. I don't know. I never heard from them again. But that's not the only time that scenario has happened to me. Some people know me and know the times I've struggled with this because there was several years where it seemed like a constant string of people came to want to stay. And for some of these, it was a big mistake on my part. I actually took in a child molester that just got out of jail. And at that time, the neighborhood I was living in was full of young children. He said, I have no place to live. I said, well, one thing you can do, we have a backyard. You can set up there for 2 days. Then you got to go. So he did that. But in the meantime, with the people that were living in our house, it caused a havoc because he admitted that to everybody. Wow. What could have happened? Well, what could have happened almost happened. Several more as well. But on the other hand, there were missionaries that came. That was always good because they were employed. And there were righteous people that came that had fallen victim to divorce that lasted quite a while because they were working and they could do exactly what the Didaché asked. They could save some money and get themselves a place, and they were anxious to when the time came. So here was a difficult situation for me that was the answer was supplied to me through this little book. And I want to go through a little of the, or probably all, the forward to my book, my translation of it, which was written by Mar Baruch Albin. Mar Baruch Albin, he is what you would call a bishop in Christianity. He lives in Kansas. I just checked with him yesterday to see if he was still alive. Last time I talked to him, he was very, very sick, and he told me he was expecting to die within the next short little time. But he's still alive, and he's getting all kinds of revelation now. He says he had a near-death experience, or what he claims is that he died a couple of years ago, and he came back completely changed. Well, maybe that was a good thing for him because, when you get sick, you get down, you get depressed. I thought that at one time he was very influential in our Nazarene communities, but since then, since his demise, he has not had any influence at all. But perhaps now that he's new, he will regain his position, especially if he really is the new man he claims to be, and I have no reason not to believe him. He wrote the foreword to my translation, and that's what I want to go through with you now in hopes that you will get this book and that you will use this book and commit to memory the do's and don'ts that are in this book. It's very similar in many ways to the Epistle of Barnabas that we went entirely through a year and a half ago, but it's much shorter and very terse as to the language. So I want to go there now. I'm going to watch my time and share with you that version. I don't know whether we'll get into the actual text tonight. We certainly will on Shabbat. This is very important. Why? Because I believe, and Mar, that means Master Albin, believes that this predates the Gospels, and that what is common in the Didaché that we find also in the Gospels came from this text and not the other way around, because the way things are put in this text are simpler or harder than the way they're put in the Gospels. It has to do with redaction. The redactor is the one that's editing the words of Yeshua, and it's common knowledge that if it's a less attractive way of writing it, then it's probably earlier. If it's a shorter saying than in the Gospels, it probably is earlier. All we have left of this book, though, only discovered again about 120, 30 years ago, was a Greek version. A Greek version. But it's obvious because, like the Gospels, this book retains Aramaicisms or Syriac words that tell us that it was originally written in Syriac or Aramaic. And that's one of the reasons why I have added to this the Aramaic word for didache in the Greek, which means teaching or a teaching. Hora'ah is the Aramaic for teaching. The rest of the book is called Lessons of the Master for All the Tribes. It's also called For the 12 Disciples. Cost of this book at my cost for printing, postage, tax, about $13. If after we go through some of this in the next few times, you want to get one of these, then if you'll send me that $13, I can't afford to pay for everyone to have a printed version. Though you can print it yourself, but I'd like you to get a printed version. I won't make any money from this whatsoever. But if you want to give $13, I'll see that you get a brand new one. And if you want to give more than that, of course, it's going to go to our mission field. Look, dedicated to the Vero Beach Yahad. I still have the recordings of when the group of us went through the book and learned and annotated it quite a few years ago, because these people helped me tear through it for the first time. And we're going to the preface. This computer kind of gets on slow jags. So 15 years ago now, guy's still alive. Here's his name, although he's Mar now, not teacher. He's the superior. The Nazarene Orthodox Kahal, 2010. And this is his writing. The Didaché ton dodeca apostolon, or teaching of the 12 apostles, is a constitution written by the second bishop of Jerusalem, Shimon, the half-brother and cousin of Yeshua HaMashiach. Yaakov ruled the church, his writing, until 62. The Didaché, therefore, must have been written between 63 and the death of Shimon in the early 2nd century. Shimon was crucified by the emperor into the beginning of the 2nd century. James the Just was cast off the parapet of the temple by the scribes and Pharisees in 62. That's why that date is important. The book was considered scripture until the Nicene Council, and yet remains part of the greater canon of the Ethiopic Church. The Ethiopic canon retained many books that the Catholic Church threw out. And of course, the two aren't in fellowship even today. If you get an Ethiopic Bible and it is complete, you're going to see lots of books in there that you may or may not be um, presented of before. The official position of the Romans on the Didaché is expressed in the Catholic Encyclopedia, in which it includes the work among the Apostolic Fathers. So, my friends, if you have the Apostolic Fathers in your library, you will have this book already, but it will still be written in churchy ecclesiastical language rather than in the language of the Aramaic fathers who were Jews. Many of those fathers considered the Didaché second only to the Hebrew scriptures. While most scholars today agree that the book was written in the first century, no one is willing to make the dogmatic statement that I have made. Well, one guy has since this was written, and that's John Robinson, a well-known theologian who is deceased at this time, but his books are still out. He has a book called Redating the New Testament. I've got it in PDF, but I don't know. There's 3 or 4 people here. If anybody wants to get that deep into this subject. So he says, I make it for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, the voice, doth call, tells me so, and my chrism of wisdom asserts the truth of this matter. Me too, I agree. However, being the lawyer and rabbi that I am, I require substantial evidence for anything that the voice says to me before I pass it on. Good idea. The book is not attributed to any particular apostle by claiming that it comes from all of them, including the one appointed after Yehuda died. It claims to speak for all of them. Only one person had authority under Essene law to speak for the Yahad, and that is, viz., the high priest and mevaker. That person from 63 to 105 was Shimon, aka Simon the Zealot. The book acts as an encyclical letter and therefore can only originate with the high priest and the mevaker, with the full support of the chief rabbi, Petros, Kepha, Peter, and the prophet Yochanan, the guy who wrote the Revelation. The book makes no mention of the destruction of the temple. The Nazarenes would definitely have supported the temple from 66 CE until 69 when the war broke out. For as a Nazarene carpenter, he was a high priest. Therefore, it can be argued that the latest date for writing is 70 AD, an important date, the year that the temple was destroyed. Because after that, there was no need for temple priests. The reason for the book is to bring order to the greater kahal, the assembly, after the execution of the mevaker and brother of the master, Yaakov ha-Tzaddik, James the Just, also known as James the Less or James the Little in the New Testament. Remembering that the Kahal was a Jewish organization, it was much more concerned about the right actions than about right beliefs, more concerned with orthopractic more than orthodox. There are no doctrinal statements in the book, but there is much about the proper way to do things, to wit, proper morals, how to baptize, how to choose bishops and deacons, how to deal with itinerant apostles, prophets, evangelists, visitors, how to know when the end was near, how to raise money for the church, what to do with tithes, etc. The fact that these ideas were central shows us that this is a statement from the orthopractic, the practicing community in Yerushalayim. The interpretations given to the Ten Commandments in the Didaché sound much like the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew, a book written to the Jews. As Matthew was written after the destruction of the temple, I don't think so. Matthew is restating Didaché, not the other way around. Many of the issues that are raised by Paul in Galatians and Romans are addressed in the book. The issues must have been considered before the Didaché, and they are generally said to have been written a few years before the death of Yaakov, although they could have been written as early as 30 AD. We don't know. All we know is the falling of Jerusalem in the temple is not in there. So it's got to be earlier than 70 AD. Clearly, the emphasis on works that the book presents is anti-Pauline. How do you pronounce that? Pauline. I hear it pronounced Pauline. That's a woman's name, my great-grandmother, Pauline. All in all, I am convinced of the early origin of the book and of its author. The book is terribly important for those of us who want to know what was said in the beginning. Dr. Snyder does a good job of recovering the original names used in the Aramaic text, which is no longer extant in existence. This book should be central to any congregation that wishes to remain true to the teachings of the Mashiach, Yeshua, because they have the approval of the family of Yeshua, those who knew him best, and of the apostles, who, after all, were close friends and family of Mashiach. While recognizing that the Christian faith has fallen seriously away from doing what the Anointed One taught, this book can provide a simple return to his original teaching. And Dr. Snyder does a good job of making it available for us again. And now for a few more minutes, I want to do the introduction to some extent. I'm trying to get you to buy this at my cost, because this needs to be around. It needs to be on your table where you can pick it up. It needs to be on the television stand where when you're watching some boring show on television, pick it up. You need to get what's in this book into your mind and heart as far as do's and don'ts. Now, in the church, there were certain things that we were taught not to do, but never really out in the public. Some of the main things we didn't dare do was drinking, beer drinking, smoking. I still hear this in church almost weekly. Drinking, smoking, carousing, although all the preachers of the mega churches are carousing these days and getting caught. Usually they go and have a little bit of teaching. They have to step down for a little while, then they come back. Let's see, what else? However, everybody must live in a glass house. Nobody knows for sure, and as you know, the only place where you're going to find two fundamentalists dancing is in a liquor store. There's some truth to that. So this teaching originated as a practical manual for leaders in the Nazarene movement. And if there ever was one, Barry Albin, this is my writing here, myself and you represent this wherever you go. That movement of the first century, you're primitives. You're going back to the beginning because the early has been lost, and all we have are certain small numbers of mutilated manuscripts that have popped out of the ground in these later centuries. That's all we have of it. We only have one of Yeshua's letters. We only have some of Paul's, but Paul was not a, a, a working Jew at that time, in accordance with what I read in Galatians, though his words are important in a lot of ways. Um, what else? Church fathers were all Gentiles. Almost all of them were committed pagans before they switched, and many of them switched only because this Roman Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire by about 324 AD. And it really was clear down from the time of the second century and the dissimilation between the Roman Church even then and the teaching of the Nazarenes and of Yeshua primarily. They're far away. They got far away under Constantine, yes, but they are even farther away. And at the time, again, by 384 or so AD, the Catholic bishops had the power and authority to have any of the other sects of so-called Christianity persecuted, executed, and their assembly places, including houses, burned down, and then either burned at the stake, chopped at the head, or crucified. This was done by the then existing Roman Catholic Church, destroying thousands of Christians at that time. Look, we have an idea that all Christianity was Roman. Not at all. There are many other groups, and there was one particular group called Aryan, not Aryan, like Hitler's Aryans, but Aryan, after a bishop named Arius, that was larger than the Roman Church. And finally, the Romans even got power over them and destroyed them. A lot of people ask what happened to the Nazarenes. They just seem to have disappeared. In fact, the ones that were able to keep together, because there was constant pressure to get them to come into Catholicism, they began to move east. And they did well and grew in Syria and Persia after the Christianity took over Rome. However, something happened in the 7th century that stopped them too, and that was Islam. Came through those parts, forced them to convert, and in forcing them to convert, many of the teachings of the Nazarene Israelites were accepted into the Islamic faith by Muhammad. That's usually not taught, but they did disappear. What's left of them, there's still some left, primarily in Iraq and what used to be called Assyria. There are some still working under the auspices of a bishopric see that holds to some versions of early Nazarene faith, but there aren't many, especially after Saddam got through with them. Many were executed, even though Saddam had one of his cabinet was one of these Assyrian Christians, Tarek Aziz, who was able to save a lot of his people. However, when he was captured in the Iraq War, he was captured and he was executed. He was hung. So dating the work as early as the 40s and 50s is confirmed by a trusted witness. Second, doctrines in common with dated sources and internal evidence. Three great witnesses here. I got a feeling I want to look at the chat for a moment. I'm sorry if this is down and deep, but you must know this. Obviously, you chosen few are really interested to even be here. I believe that's right. Joshua Heidelbaugh, quantum physics will prove Yahuwah to those who think science explains anything other than him and how little we actually know. Yes, it's going to end up there. No doubt about it. Excited quantum physics. I'm excited too. I just wish I could find somebody who had the ability and the faith to teach it to us so we could understand it. That's right. He lived through the Jewish War. What is that? Yeah, yeah. Serve them like a type of God. I'll tell you why. What I think is why. Peter says, obey the emperor too. That's why, that's one reason why the letters of Peter, the one anyway, the first one is fake. It's fake because we have his acts, and in the Nazarene Acts, he wouldn't bow to anybody. He was straight on. He was hard driven. He was executed. So we think. All right. Thank you for those chats. Let me take it up. I'm not going to go that much longer. Okay. As to scholarly secondary witnesses, such as the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, if that's all the only source you have, it's called a secondary source, then use it. List the many sources that cite Didaché and thereby suggest the date of composition to be during the mid to late first century. I would agree with that. It can't be early first century, but the fact is, there are a lot of these Gentiles that quoted this little book, but the book itself disappeared. Disappeared until the 19th century when there was a lot of archaeological work going on to try to find these things. Why do you think this disappeared if it was quoted by so many Gentiles? It should have been received in the canon, but it wasn't. Think about why. I think you'll have a pretty good understanding of why once we get into the book itself. Other early sources deal with the same subject matter as the Didaché. For instance, and this you've heard many times in our liturgy, that is the two roads found in chapters 1 through 5. It's also a prominent doctrine in the Epistle of Barnabas. There's a light road, there's a dark road, there's a good road, there's a bad road. There are two spirits that want you to follow them. The Charter of a Jewish Sectarian Association, QS, that is the Yahad rule. And there's another text there at Qumran, the two roads, 4Q473. Now look, this gives us the understanding to find this teaching in here that it followed the earlier teaching of these Essenes. Just so little need to doubt that the Essenes and those called Jewish Christians today were not one. How can you believe that? The communion, the Eucharistic liturgy of the teaching retains a reference to the vine of David. which would surely have been excised, taken out, if this were in use in anti-Semitic or Gentilo-centric venues, such as the Gentile assemblies ruled by Ignatius of Antioch, a fervent Jew hater, and the bishop of about 7 assemblies there, just after the time of John the Revelator. I don't think I have any water left. No, I'm dry. This manual, just as the title suggests, is meant for new assemblies, which Mar Albin called Kahalim, including proselytes, new people, and neophytes, new people, but not necessarily for Gentiles. As you will see that several of the rules laid down in this manual are completely ignored or possibly even purposely changed or done away with in the creeds of Christianity. In addition, here's another doctrine from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is the true prophet. To distinguish the one person from hundreds and thousands of others in our day that are not telling the truth. The true prophet is prominent in the Petrine Clementine literature. It's also explained in the Didaché, as are rules that deal with false apostles, prophets, and teachers. What do you do with them? Implying that the community leadership was new and not yet firmly established in contending with the false. Inexperienced leaders, therefore, need not rely on the spirit of discernment to determine true from false at first, but could rely on the Didaché until such supernatural abilities were developed. The apocalyptic section at the end is brief, not weighed down by heavy symbolism and exaggerations, as are the Apocalypse, Second Esdras, or the Enochic literature, again suggesting a date early in the history of the sect, very early, before the accumulation of written material, apocalyptic or otherwise. Since its rediscovery in the late 19th century, scholars and all those interested in the historical Jesus are now enthralled with this little handbook. But unfortunately, churches don't mention it. Christian faith very seldom speaks about this. Why? It would be frowned upon. Bishops, preachers would be frowned upon, and besides, many of the preachers wouldn't even know it exists because they're uneducated people, which is not prohibitive for being a preacher, but I would think that a person who has such an important job and also such a difficult job would want to move along farther in their experience of faith and in their knowledge, because they're telling other people things that the other people are believing are true because these are holy men, supposedly. They need to know more. The Didaché is now included in the ante-Nicene fathers. Anti here doesn't mean against. It means in the beginning, the early Nicene fathers. That particular book, I think it's volume 8 of the Apostolic Fathers and volume 1. These are the earliest ones they were able to capture, including the Aramaic ones. I have this volume here. You can get just the volume itself on eBay if you want to read these letters and books. It's quite amazing, really, what they believed, what they did. You can get it on eBay. I don't know, probably $8. It's a big, thick book. Collection along with the related text, Barnabas and Hermas. Just ask me for them. I'll send them to you in a PDF. The Sinaitic manuscript has an empty space. That's the earliest full New Testament. To accommodate the Didaché, the Didaché was torn out of that text when Tischendorf, in 1840 or so, discovered it at St. Catherine's Monastery on top of the mountain, top of Mount Sinai, it was called, near Jerusalem. He was being entertained by the monks at that, and went there to look for old texts, looking for old biblical texts, and he was having a drink around the fire with the monks, and he saw one monk get up and take a few leaves from some old parchment, throw them on the fire to keep warm. And he said, "Oh, what are you throwing in the fire?" And he walked over there and took a look. One look told him that they were using an ancient New Testament Septuagint text for their fire. And they started tearing it off at the end of the book, throwing pages in. They had thrown away the entire Didaché. Then came the Epistle of Barnabas. Then came the Shepherd of Hermas. And then came Revelation at that time, when that was built. There were 3 more books, Hebrew books, on the end of the New Testament. Among those of the current, look at that, I made a mistake. Can I fix it? Yeah. Neo-Nazarene movement, at its most important, the Didaché is canonical and authoritative, more highly prized than the Pauline epistles, believe it or not. At its least, it's still considered an authentic apostolic rule, useful in establishing new congregations. If the tradition is true that Shimon bar Cleopas is the author editor, then this work is not only genuinely apostolic, but originated in the dynastic family of Yeshua, the Nazarene, known as the Christ. 2 other names for him, Zelotes and Simon of Cana, or the Canaanian. Christ Jesus is the Christian pseudonym of Yeshua HaMashiach, according to Matthew 2:23. Now we're going to talk about the translations, just a little bit left of this, and we'll go on. This translation, to stay consistent with my other translations in addition, some of you have read them, some have read all of them. I'm again reseeding Hebrew, Hebraic names and technical terms while excising, taking out churchy generica, being as I am dedicated to restoring our Sky Father's true name, titles, and technical terms that academia and churchianity have kept buried since the 4th century. Of all these people looking to God, looking to Christ, looking to the Lord, these all come out of paganism. They all come out of paganism. You know, the closest we can get to the language of the original writers. Well, I've written this up if you want to read the substitutes. It's in my new translation of the Apocalypses of the New Testament, which I'm going to send up and publish here pretty soon. That tells you most all of them, those included, especially the worst is the Lord.